EU-China relations are key in the European diplomacy, due to the importance of China, due to the fact that EU-China economic and trade relationship increased very much these last years. So China is a key partner for the EU on economic side, and therefore, due to the importance of economy on the political side also. So I think in the following year to come, we will have a deepening of the EU-China relationship. We will have at the EU level the EU elections in all the EU states for the EU Parliament.
Yeah.
That is important. You have to know that in the EU there are a certain number of political parties in several countries are proposing to have a more restrained policy with China. So we will have to see what parliament is coming from the elections. Is it a parliament with a majority of parties with a populist policy that could lead to some difficulties in the relationship with China? If we have a parliament with a majority of parties favorable to multilateralism, that could smooth relationship with China.
Okay, great. And do you spot any changes? I mean, the factors you have all mentioned, you mentioned just now, has already taken place, in this year. Do you spot any changes of this position and the place?
I personally, I'm convinced that we need to have a strong relationship with China, because China should not be seen as an enemy, but as a partner. For me, that is something important. This being said, yes, there are some preoccupations in Europe. Preoccupation concerns, for instance, the selling of high technology to Chinese companies, and you have seen that there are debates now at EU level to have some restrictions brought to the export of high tech to China. That is a debate. Personally, I'm convinced that some agreement can be reached on that part, that should not bring to strong measures to limit trade with China. I think we in Europe, it's our interest to have a strong China, economically speaking. Imagine a weak China, imagine a China with a lot of financial difficulties, economic difficulties, unemployment raising in China. You will see more and more migrants from China coming to Europe. Are we able to accept them? No. So we have the interest to have a strong China, a China that is continuing with its growth. It is also bringing opportunities for our companies, either our companies who are already in China, either our companies based here who can eventually develop stronger partnerships with Chinese companies.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You just mentioned a migrant. This is my first time to hear this. We have already have this kind of story, maybe 100 years ago. Like many Chinese migrants here. But how do you say the development of China-EU relationship in this year? Is it faster or or slower?
Well, in some way it is fast because the growth is continuing. In another way, there have been some breaks. Some countries have pushed to have a more detailed review, scanning of Chinese investment in their countries in order to limit them eventually. Some other countries, I'm thinking to Central Europe for instance, are much more open. And it is interesting because some of these countries on one side have a policy where they promote more borders, like Hungary or Poland. And on the other side, wants a stronger relationship with China. And I think they view more China as a country that can help them economically speaking by investing more in their own country, which is fully understandable. But you have to be consequent. And personally, I think the solution is not in erecting more borders that will solve Europe problems eventually. So that is something we saw. We saw more Chinese investment coming, at least in some countries. We saw some countries like Germany a little bit more reluctant. Germany, who had a strong economic relationship with China. Some countries like Belgium, who are still very open to China, who see now some companies coming, well known, like Alibaba, who announced to have reached an agreement with Liège Airport for a logistical center. These are, I think, important news. I think that the challenge will be to attract more small and medium-sized companies from China to our country, and to have more Belgian medium-sized companies to go to China. Because, as we know, in China, like in Belgium or in Europe, SMEs are the majority of the companies, are the companies who make the biggest figures in trade. So the challenge is to have more of these kind of companies brought in connection.
So in your view, what is the biggest achievements on the development of their bilateral relations in the past year?
In the past year,
I mean, in 2018.
I know. Well, I would say the biggest achievement is maybe on one side the fact that growth in trade continued. That is something important. Biggest achievement is also the fact that you have a strong dialogue between EU and China. We are not shouting at each other. We are not at war. That is something important. At EU level, we are convinced that if there are difficulties, well, that can be discussed around the table, not with slogans, but with concrete discussions. And also, I think that is the brand, the characteristic.
So, I mean, if we put some reasons on these achievements, how did this happen? What is the most important reasons for these achievements, in your view?
In my view, the most important reasons is that EU realizes that the partnership with the USA is maybe less strong than it was before. That China is not a threat. politically and militarily speaking.
Yeah.
China is not at our borders, like Russia, for instance. And we realize also that, as I said before, China, economically speaking, is the number 2 in the world economy and soon the number 1. So we need to have a strong partnership with such a country.
Okay, great. And so we have speaking about the achievements. How about the failures or difficulties?
Well, as I mentioned, fears and difficulty. I think difficulties, you have seen that in the position paper of the EU Chamber of Commerce in China,
Yeah.
where a certain number of European companies complain that it is sometimes they have sometimes some difficulties in China, that the market is not as open as they would like. And on that, we have seen that the government and the president Xi Jinping have clearly mentioned that they want to go to a further opening of the Chinese market.
Yeah.
I think that is a very positive sign, and we hope that it will go in that direction. So that was one difficulty. Another difficulty is the fact that some countries like Germany, like France, are concerned with the selling of high-tech companies to China, fearing that all the high-tech of the country will leave the country.
Yeah.
I would say. So that is a preoccupation. And I think there should be eventually there can be some limit put, and there should be some further discussion with China around that. I think we should try to avoid unilateral decisions, but try to reach agreements on these issues.
Yeah. And I have heard and I have read many stories on the newspaper here in Europe, and some newspaper just say China and Europe have structural conflicts. How do you like this kind of comment?
I would say you can always see things in a pessimistic way. The number of times I heard these last 20 years, 30 years, people saying, well, China will crash, China economy cannot continue to grow, China this, China that, and that was not true. Alors, you can say, voilà, yes, we have problems and we will never be able to solve these problems, and then it will be the big chaos. I think there are a lot of canals of discussions. It is true that China is now more and more important, and for EU, the difficulty at EU level is that we have on one side the EU level and the other side the national level.
Yeah.
So that makes also sometimes a little bit difficult already within Europe to reach a common policy, because the interest in Europe are not always the same. I mentioned Central Europe is very much interested to opening to China because they want and they need some further Chinese investments. Some other Western European countries are a little bit more reluctant, saying we are afraid of the selling of the high tech. So that is already a difficulty within Europe, and I think for China to apprehend that is also not always easy, because when you discuss at EU level That is one thing, but you have also to take into account the national policies and sometimes the regional policies within Europe. And so structurally you can say, voilà, we will have more and more conflictual situation. I don't think so. I think we should have to continue our dialogue. I think one of the big discussions that is taking place for the moment is the discussion of an investment treaty.
Yeah.
We don't know when an agreement will be reached. I hope we will reach such an agreement. I'm not sure it will be reached before elections next year for the EU Parliament. Off the record, I would say I don't think so.
Yeah.
Why? Because before the elections, you will have the temptations in a certain number of countries to say, look, the danger comes from outside, and outside that can be China, and such a treaty would be dangerous for Europe, and you would have a whole campaign on that. So my impression is that we have to see the composition of the next parliament, because such a treaty should be approved by the European Parliament.
Yeah.
The Commission negotiates, but the Parliament has to approve. And I'm not sure it will be approved before the elections. Then we have to see what will be the new Parliament, and in function of that, if a treaty can be signed or not.
Yeah. So you have mentioned a lot about the coming year's election. In which way they're gonna reshape the EU's policy towards China?
Well, in fact, we'll have to see which parties will dominate the next parliament.
Maybe EPP?
Can be EPP. Impression is that socialist group could diminish, but in favor of more populist parties.
Yeah, exactly.
That is, for me, it's a little bit a danger, because it's very difficult to foresee then what they will decide. Because look at, for instance, Italy. Italy has a government now dominated by two populist parties.
Yeah.
On one side, they speak about protecting their market, erecting more borders. On the other side, they say they want to also closer ties with China. So it's a little bit contradictory, I would say. So if we have an EU Parliament dominated by such kind of parties, you can have a little bit an erratic policy at that level. If you have a parliament dominated by more traditional parties, like the EPP, like the Socialists, like the Liberals, things could be smoother. Be aware also that the Green parties can also go up. The Green parties are more focused on environment policies. I'm not sure that they would be pushing for more for closer ties with China.
So it's a question mark.
It's a question mark.
Okay, great. And let's talk more about the screening of the investment from China. So how does this kind of a screening mechanism will influence the China-EU relationship?
Well, it can influence it, because if the screening is very strong, I would say, and following that screening, many projects are rejected, that will have a negative effect on the EU-China relationship. So we'll have to see how it will be applied in reality.
And if this kind of screening were very strong, do you have any suggestions for the Chinese?
The screening policy is always dangerous, I think, because it is very well to do that at EU level, but China could do the same with EU investments.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it would be something good for our investors in China, present in China. I think China will inevitably, in discussions with the EU, draw the attention of the EU authorities to the fact that if they unilaterally decide of a certain number of measures, China can do the same, and then what? We have seen that with the so-called trade war between China and the US. US started with imposing special taxes on imports of a certain number of goods. China retaliated by doing the same. And so what? We are going to go up, which will make trade more difficult. We hope that the US-China trade conflict will cool down. A good sign was following the meeting of Mr. Trump and President Xi that they agreed to stop for the moment at the US level the imposing of new taxes. But it's not a final agreement.
Yeah, it's just a truce.
It's temporary. It's a truce. So let's see what will come. Because if the trade war starts again, everyone will lose. China will lose, US will lose, and Europe also. Because it is not good for trade in general.
Yeah, talking about this screening mechanism inside EU, how will this kind of mechanism operate? I mean, if they got any one single country member object, say I refuse to the results, what the EU gonna do?
To be honest with you, I did not check yet in detail about the mechanism. I don't have personally information on how they are going to apply this, but it could be a little bit like anti-dumping cases. That means that the Commission makes an inquiry, the Commission impose some sanctions, but as I told you, I'm not well informed